Hey everyone, here's a tutorial on how to sync puppeteered animation to audio. Now this is a breakdown on how I would tackle puppeteering to an audio source. There's other ways you can do it, but hopefully you can take away something from my approach. For example, even though I try to keep this as tight as I can, there's a couple instances where I'm really trying to work out a problem, going back, making some changes. So hopefully you can see through that process uh, ways of tackling and problem solving some of these more complex animations. Now, I know this example is a little specific. I'm trying to animate a drummer to a groove I recorded. But I think this is a good test because it's all about pulse and rhythm, and it's easy to try to snap to that pulse. And if you're off, it definitely shows. Because this tutorial is a little more challenging, I'm tagging it as intermediate to advanced skill level. So I won't be going over the fundamentals of Quill. For that, I recommend checking out any of Goro Fujita's tutorials, which I'll link to in the description. I learned everything I know about working Quill by watching his tutorials, so I highly recommend them. So what makes this special, and why share this tutorial? For me, when I figured out how to puppeteer in this way, it was like getting superpowers. In Quill, it really enables you to capture personality in your animation. And I think this would be super hard to do in traditional 3D software. I mean, especially for someone like me who isn't a trained animator. This style of animation, puppeteering, lets me focus on the acting part. And actually, a lot of the character animation in Alex's Sci-Fi World was done using these techniques. So to get started here, I'm going to break down what you saw in the intro, starting with planning your project, then to setting it up, and lastly, the fun parts. When starting a challenge like this, I would first listen to the audio and really understand it. I would also try and visualize what it would look like. This one is hard, but try to get a feel for the visuals and how they would match to the mood of the audio. If it's aggressive, consider fast, jerky motions, etc. Also consider what the rhythm of the audio is and how that translates to movement. This can also be done with speaking or other audio sources. I mean, I find rhythm in everything, really. One important thing here would be to physically practice the character moves. What tends to happen when you test this stuff out physically is you start to discover how you're going to break down the animation. I mean, this is pretty common knowledge for most animators, but I think it's worth bringing up here, especially considering this animation is pretty complex. So let's start talking about setting up your Quill file. Now I'm going to walk through these in detail with some visuals, step by step, in Quill, but let's quickly go over how I break this down. The first step being to import your audio. Second, set your global frame rate. Third is to set the overall sequence loop to match the audio. After that, you want to decide which elements are appropriate for frame by frame versus keyframe animation. And lastly, isolate character parts into separate layers for animation. So while I'm going through these videos in Quill, I want to call out something because I'm going to be doing this quite often and it's not very visual. It's hard to see what I'm doing actually. And it's the importance of using your controllers to get around Quill. Now you can use a lot of the buttons on the controllers to do things like play your animation and jump to the start of the timeline, things like that, undo. So I'll be doing these quite often as I go through the video. So you can see here the thing I'm showing off is pressing your thumb on the left thumbstick will show you this little menu which gives you some options on how to navigate the timeline. And the important one that I want to call out is putting the controller into an alt state. And by doing that, you pull the left trigger and hold that, which then puts everything in alt mode. And you can see when I'm pressing the thumbstick here, the options are changing. So what I'll be doing quite often is jumping to the start of the timeline. And to do that, I'll pull the left trigger, put it in alt mode, and then press the left thumbstick left so that it quickly jump me to the start of the timeline. So I definitely recommend studying the button mapping that comes in Quill. I think it's on the website too. just so that you can get some muscle memory around using the controllers to get around Quill. That will speed up your time in Quill dramatically. So you'll see me do this as I'm going through the tutorial. I'm moving kind of fast, and it might be hard to tell. I'll try to call those things out when they're important, but highly recommend learning the different button mappings and button operations and so on. So first things first, let's get our audio source into our project. You go over here, new sound layer, click on that. Navigate to your file on your operating system, select it, select. So now I have my audio source in. You can zoom, you can make it larger or smaller by grabbing it and using your thumbstick. I don't want to see that, so I can hide it by pressing the visibility icon here. Turn that off. So I want this to loop because this is a continuous, or this is one section of the groove that will then loop. So I can play it so you can hear it here. So it should loop right after that. There's a couple ways you can do that. One way, and since I had recorded this in an audio software and I made sure that this is one section of a drum groove that should loop, I know that it's going to loop nicely if I just go to settings here and hit loop. And you can see now the groove is continuing. So let's just hear that. Okay, so it's a nice clean loop. But if you don't have access to audio software, you're bringing in an audio source, you want it to loop, you could put it into a sequence and loop it from there. So the way you do that is to go to new sequence here, select your audio source, bring it into your group, and let's select the sequence. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the audio source, and I'm going to try to start and stop it where I think the loop ends, and try to contain it into the sequence that way. So by doing that, I will press in the left thumbstick to play it and press the thumbstick in again to stop it. Okay, so I think that's where the loop starts and stops again. So without moving my playhead, I have the sequence selected. I'm going to hit this button here, which says loop this sequence at playhead position. You can see now the wave file is continuing. Another indicator is your origin of the loop is the blue, the selected blue. It's a lighter blue where the loop repeats. So that's another indicator that you know that this is now a looping sequence. So let's jump to the beginning and let's play and see if it is a nice smooth loop. It's a little delayed. So one way I can fix that is to go in and move the playhead back a little bit. Make a decision, let's say it's right here. I will undo the sequence and redo it because now I'm just trimming that audio source. So let's try it again and see how it sounds. So it's a little delayed. So I can continue doing that until I get it to where I want it. Okay, so that sounds like it's pretty close. So we will use that. So I've gone ahead and moved the drum kit and the drummer meshes into the sequence, and I'm going to name it by punching into it. And I'm going to call it drummer sequence. So this is a naming structure or naming logic that I use. If it's a sequence, I'll call it SEQ. If I'm using that folder to transform a group of layers, I would just call it -tran, just to indicate it's transform. Sequence, you see that there's an icon here, and you'll see in the timeline some indicators for that, but it's just easy for me to scan and glance and see that this is a sequence. And next, what I want to do is start deconstructing my drummer mesh here. So I know that I want to animate the arms and limbs frame by frame. And the reason for that is I want some organic movement from the arms and leg here. The head and the body, not so much, because it'll just be moving as a solid piece. But the arms are going to have a little bit more complex movement happening. So I'm going to isolate those. And the way I do that is I will use the selection tool, which you can find by going to Tools and the selection tool here, or I believe it is the X button on your controller. You can swap between your brush and selection tool. I use that a lot. So now I'm going to select the arm here. And actually another thing I want to do is let's just collapse this timeline, because I'm just trying to organize my project. I'm not trying to do any animation right now, and this just makes it a lot cleaner to organize things, and I don't have to worry about any of the other UI right now. So I'm going to select the arm, the right arm here, select all the mesh there, and then I'm going to New Paint Layer. I click that, and what it does is it takes that mesh information and it drops it into a new layer, creates a new layer for you. And again, punch into the layer here to rename it. I'm going to call it arm right. And I'll do the same thing for the left arm. So make sure I go back to drummer, which is the main mesh. I will select the left arm with the selection tool, go to new paint layer, and then now it has its own layer. Rename it to arm left. And so I'll continue that exact same workflow for the leg and also for the head and the body, which I will do keyframe transform animations with. Now I have all of the elements I want to animate isolated from the drummer, like the body, the head, the arms. And now I'm going to start thinking about structuring those into folders for animation. And the way I kind of think about it is, and stay with me here, this idea of waterfall. So let's say I have these folders here, and I have these layers that are nested inside of that folder. And say there's another folder here, more stuff nested. What's going to happen is if I animate this folder, the sequence, then the waterfall effect is going to happen where whatever I do for animation on this one is going to affect all of these. So that's the waterfall. It's kind of affecting everything below it, if that makes sense. So I'm going to try to group things logically that way, knowing that's how things work. And so let's say the body, I want to have a gentle sway. And so I'm going to group the head, the arms together. So when I do that animation and do this gentle sway, everything's moving together. So I'll go over here and create a new sequence. And I will move these body, the head, the arms into that folder. So you can see here, it's going to be something like this. So I'm going to name this body. Actually, let's call it torso. Be more specific. Torso. Oh, and let's do transform, because this will be puppeteered. I'm going to apply that same logic to the body and the head as well. So I'm going to call this body head transform. So I know these are all going to be puppeteered and transformed using transform keyframes. Then the right arm and left arm will be frame by frame, which I'll get to in a minute. There's a couple more things I want to share before we move on to animation. One thing is, as I mentioned before, you can use Quill to edit your audio sources. And a couple things you can do there is to grab your audio file and you can move it around like this. You can also trim your audio file by hovering over the ends, whether it be the left or the right, and trimming it this way. The other thing I want to cover is, this is a personal thing that I like to do, but since a lot of these files become so heavy and complicated with folders and layers, I like to sort of hide, if you will, or de-emphasize the things I'm not working on. So since we're going to be getting into animation with these layers here, I want to kind of hide the things that I'm not really concerned about for the animation. So what I'll do is I'll lock them, which grays them out, and makes the things I'm working on stand out a little bit more. So I find that very useful when working in larger files that have a lot of layers and folders. And the last part, the funnest part, let's talk about animation. So with animation, there's a couple steps we're going to go through here, and we're going to walk through it in Quill. The first thing would be to actually grab and then puppeteer duplicated frames. So that being the limbs, the arms, the legs, that sort of thing. After that, we're going to record puppeteered keyframe transforms, being the torso and the head. Once you're done puppeteering those animations, then you want to go in and clean up the layers. And lastly, we'll nest animations into sequences so we can connect the two different animation types. Okay, so let's get into some animation. One thing I want to call out first, though, is I did change up the layer and the folder structure just a little bit. And I basically split the frame-by-frame animation from the keyframe transform animations. And the reason why I did that was so that I can just get more space for the head and the torso so that I can really have time to act and perform it and give it some more personality. The frame-by-frame stuff fits in with the drum loop and it's super efficient. It's like 3.5 seconds or so, and you can kind of see this dark line where that repeats. So everything inside of this sequence will then repeat at this 3.5 seconds. That's great if I want to do duplicated transform animation because I don't want to do a lot of frames because that can be expensive for processing. Also, with our high frame rate here for the global frame rate, if you're trying to grab and puppeteer frame by frame and you have a lot of frames, that can be really janky and it can really slow your computer down. Let's start by animating the right arm. And so that's going to be a frame by frame animation. And I want it to loop here. So I want to duplicate frames enough that fits in this 3.5 second loop. So I'm going to select the right arm layer. And the trick here, since there's a lot of frames, is to use your controller to create those. So the way you do that would be to pull the left trigger, which puts it in alt mode. You can kind of see it here when I put my thumb on the thumbstick, this little icon right here, that's going to create a duplicated frame, just like that. So if we zoom in here, you can see it, duplicated frame. If I hold that thumbstick down, you can see it's adding. So I don't have to manually do that and click on it all these times. I can just hold it down. Let's zoom out, see where I'm at. It takes a long time to get there. But I want to hit this line here because I'm going to fill up this entire loop with duplicated frames. And getting close. Let's slow it down. Okay, we got one more. Boom, there it is. All right, so let's bring it back to the beginning of the timeline. And now we're going to get into it and have some fun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the grab tool. So go to your tools, get the grab tool. You've got it selected there. Go back to your timeline. Now here's where you have a lot of trial and error. This part gets pretty tricky because it's a performance and you're trying to perform with the software and use it to your advantage. So I'll do a couple passes at it just so we can see it and how I would go about it. But then, yeah, I think it'll be up for you to really just have a go at it and just trial and error. And one trick here that I want to call out as I do this is you want to get the arm in this case pretty close to my actual arm. And then with your grab tool, you can see here another alt trick you can do is you press the left trigger, which puts you in alt mode, and then in your right thumbstick, you can increase the sphere of influence on the center, which is good for arms. That's something I found. And because what I'm going to do is increase this up so that the outside sphere is on my upper arm and the inside sphere of influence is just covering the stick and my hand, something like that. So let's try to see. Okay, it's a little, you can see it's kind of bendy, but that's okay. We kind of want that. So I would undo that. You're going to be undoing quite a lot here, which is left. It is your right thumbstick and you're pressing left on the right thumbstick. So let's increase the sphere a little bit. Okay, so that looks pretty good. The upper arm's just barely moving. So when we looked at the real life footage, it looks pretty accurate to that. All right, so let's go ahead and start puppeteering these duplicated frames. So I'm going to hit play. And another thing I want to call out is I'm going to wait for the loop to start on the second time. So it gives me some time to anticipate when it starts. And when I anticipate, I'm going to start downwards and then come up so that when it loops again, it kind of hopefully will catch that repetitive motion. So let's try that now. So you see it's a little slow at the start. I didn't really start fast enough. And there's also some kind of weird things that are happening. It's jumping a little bit when it loops. So we can just keep doing that. Just keep trying and trying until we get to a good spot. So let's stop. We'll go to the beginning. We'll undo what we just did. And we'll try it again. Okay, so after some trial and error, I think I got it to an okay spot for now. It could obviously be a lot better. It's just an animation, so it's representation of what I want to get, so it won't be perfect. But I'm finding something interesting as I'm going through the animation. And what I'm finding is that when it starts, the animation is a little slow at the start. And then it sort of gets into the rhythm, the tempo, the pulse. And then the loop starts over again pretty quickly, and it's a slow start, and then it gets to tempo. So it just doesn't look right. So what I want to do, and what I noticed that I discovered, was something kind of interesting. Like I said before, I'll let the loop run once, so I'm sort of in tempo with it. And what I've been doing is kind of using the grab tool and practicing that pulse on the first loop. So I'm going with the pulse. I'm getting up to speed with the pulse with the grab tool and kind of practicing the motions. And as the second loop starts, I catch the geometry by pulling the right trigger. So I'm basically grabbing the geometry at that point, and then it's recording my movements. So what that's doing is it starts the loop at speed, and it doesn't look like it's catching up to the pulse at the start of the loop. So it's not perfect, but it's close enough. So now I just repeated that same workflow, that same process for the left arm and the right leg, which looks something like this. Let's hit mute here. So yeah, the left arm and the right leg were a lot easier, I think, because there was breaks in between, whereas the right hand, it's constantly moving throughout the loop. So it made it a lot easier to work with the other limbs. So now that's in, let's get to some of the puppeteering with keyframe transforms. All right, so next I'm going to record some puppeteering from our drummer's head here. The first thing I want to do is set a couple keys. I'll set one at the start. I'll give myself some space to puppeteer in, let's say like 20 seconds, which is a few of those loops. I'll hit one there. And this is super important. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to make sure that the start and then the end of this loop has the same position for his head, so that when the loop restarts or loops again, the head doesn't jump around, doesn't snap around. Now to get this layer set up for recording your puppeteering, I need to make sure it's set to transform, because that lets me sort of move it around there. And then also I want to toggle the recording on by hitting the record button up here. And now all is left for me to do is just hit play and then start the performance. Okay, so let's play that back. So I'll jump to the start and I'll play it back and see how that looks. Okay, so it's working. And now what I want to start doing is trimming this up and matching it to the drum loop again, because once I start trimming and moving things, it'll be off. But I want to trim it so that, because there's a gap here in the start where I'm waiting for the loop to repeat. So I'm going to take that first key and I'll move it closer in to where I started puppeteering, and I will trim this part so it kind of starts where that key is, and then I will move that whole thing to the start like that, and I will do the same for the other end. I will move the last key over, but what I want to look out for here is I want to align this loop, this whole sequence, to the drum loop, which is this line here you can see. So that's the closest one that's coming up. So I will put the playhead on that, make sure I zoom in and get accurate there. Then I'm going to select the sequence and set that to a loop. So now this sequence for the keyframes is aligned with the sequence for the frame by frame. So they should work together. Okay, so one last thing I want to do with this to clean it up is I'm going to select all of these frames. You can see it here. You go to select all and set the interpolation. Make sure it's set to linear. In this case, it's already set, but by default it's stepped. What I want to do here is create linear transitions so that when it goes from the start position, it's a smooth transition to the start, and the same thing with the end. It smoothly transitions to its start position. So let's see what that looks like and see if it works. Okay, so one thing I noticed that I forgot to do was to make sure that this puppeteered animation aligns with the pulse of the drum groove. So I should have done that before I trimmed this, but let's go ahead and do that now. So let's just play it. So let's say there's a kick drum hit right around this time, and the head going down on the kick drum beat is right about there. So let's move this whole thing. Let's trim it. Get these over here. Trim it and move it. And let's see if that looks okay. It's close enough. I think you can go in and really finesse this and get it right. I should have done that at the start, and I would have had an easier time and a better result of trimming it and cleaning it up. But that's typically the process I go through for puppeteering and cleaning up the layer. So the last thing I want to talk about is the concept of the waterfall effect, which I talked about earlier. And it's one way to really bring everything together in your animation. In this case, it's a little janky, but that's okay. It's expressive. One thing I do want to fix, though, is if you notice, the torso and the limbs just aren't connected. It's because I wanted these to have a longer sequence than the sort of shorter drum loop sequence of the arms. So, since both of these sequences are aligned right here after 3 loops, we get 1 loop for the torso. I can then drop this limb sequence into this torso sequence so it's nested, and it should be able to connect and look more unified. So let's try that and see how that looks. There you go. So now you can see the arms are moving with that torso because they're nested inside of that torso sequence. So that's kind of a great way to bring everything together so it feels unified and cohesive. And that's the end result.